Well, Steve, great to have you here, and welcome to Toronto.
Thank you, Giles.
And I think it's going to be an interesting conversation because over the last several days, I think one pervasive theme of the conversations has been the huge impact here and globally of America First.
Right.
And it's a change point, a historic change point, I think, for all of us. And we're all trying to understand it a little bit better and what drives it. And I think that's kind of mostly the conversation we want to have. And then I think at the tail end of it will kind of drive a little bit further into, the impact on Canada, because obviously we're in the crosshairs now of some significant negotiations on trade.
Right.
But I think, to kick things off, it might be helpful for the audience here to get a bit of a flavor of you. And I think it's interesting, your background. You're from Chicago, your Hispanic background. I think if we were 30 years ago, we would have said Steve Cortes, the Democrat.
Right.
And here you are, part of the MAGA Republican Party, part of the movement.
Right.
And I think it'd be really useful to get a sense of how you got there.
Sure. No, it is a very good question, and you're right. Somebody with my bio in previous decades might very well have been a Democrat, but the Republican Party has been totally transformed by the America First movement, and particularly by Donald Trump. So the America First movement broadly, but specifically through the leadership of Donald Trump, and it is really the pro-worker party. And as evidence of that, for example, people with graduate degrees, people who are in the credentialed managerial elite in the United States who previously were Republicans, they were sort of typical country club Republicans, they're now almost entirely Democrats, especially if they live in coastal areas, right? So if we look at that demography, working class people are generally Republicans now. But the party has been taken over. It was a hostile takeover, by the way, Giles. It wasn't a willing handing of the keys of the Republican Party, but it has been fully transformed. And regarding Hispanics, particularly, the move there has just been astounding. And it's been a lot of my work over the last 10 years has been outreach to Hispanic voters. We've had tremendous success. On the negative side, Hispanics find that they are no longer welcome in the radical Democrat Party of the 2020s. Hispanics overwhelmingly pro-family, religious, hardworking people, patriotic. They simply don't find a home in the party of Ilhan Omar in the modern Democrat Party. So that's part of it. Then on the positive side, they're also attracted to the populist nationalist muscularity of America First. That's very attractive to a lot of Hispanics, particularly Hispanic men. And the gains we've made there have been, just truly astounding. I've documented a lot of it. I do a lot of documentaries on this. I write a lot about what's going on with Hispanics. If you look at Starr County, Texas, is the most Hispanic county in America. It's on the U.S.-Mexico border. It's almost entirely Hispanic, 97% Hispanic. Trump lost Starr County by 60%, 6-0, back in 2016. He got clobbered there, like most Republicans have historically. He won Starr County this time. He went from -60 to +16 in 3 election cycles in the most Hispanic county in America. If you go much further north, similar kind of county, even though it's urban, Passaic County in New Jersey. New Jersey has an election coming up. Passaic County, he lost by 22% in 2016. He won Passaic County, which is a working class, dense New York metro area Hispanic county. So the gains there have been astounding. So in that regard, although it might be surprising to folks, I am part, as a guy named Cortes, I'm part of a much bigger trend of Hispanics in America.
I mean, it's interesting because, if you go back, 40 years, I guess now, you think about the Reagan Democrats, people, in the 1980 election, a lot of blue collar workers voted Republican for Reagan, and there was a kind of a muscularity to that as well. Mm-hmm. Morning in America, all of that. Right. Is this really a reverberation of that, or is it a kind of a second wave of that, or is it fundamentally different?
I do think it's fundamentally different, and in this respect, that the Reagan wave, while it was super impressive, and I think he was an incredible president, it was very outward facing, right? It was a lot of it was about the Cold War. A lot of it was about the struggle globally, and we really have almost the exact opposite focus, right? That America is too interventionist in the world, that we have worried too much about what is happening with the rest of the globe. We've tried to manage the globe in some ways like it's some chessboard. We've mostly mismanaged it, by the way. It hasn't been good for the United States, not good for our deficits, not good for working class people. So it's very different, fundamentally different in that regard, that it is far more inward looking. And I know that's problematic for a lot of the folks in this room, and I understand that, but that is the decision effectively of the American people, that we want We want populist nationalist policies, and they didn't just win in the Electoral College this time, they won in the popular vote, which I think is, surprised almost everybody. But this is now a majority movement in the United States. And again, I know that creates a lot of consternation in a lot of other places, including allies like Canada, but that is the emerging reality, and it's primarily because the previous globalist mentality just did not serve working people. Working class people in the United States, and this is true in a lot of other countries, but in the United States, they've seen their standard of living go down now for a sustainable period of time. And they won't take it anymore. They've revolted through politics against watching their standard of living go lower, working harder to have a quality of life that is not consistent with what your parents and even grandparents lived.
I mean, it's easy to understand that, and I think you see that around the world, where there's there's sort of economic divide is obviously always been a major force in politics. But what's interesting to the rest of the world, I think people in Canada looking at the U.S. is, and I think around the world looking at the U.S. is a sense of, wow, this country's never been wealthier. If you think about the trade imbalances that has been such a focus of President Trump's attention, and looking at China, looking at Europe, looking at Japan, South Korea, and us, and we'll get to that in a minute. But what's a bit surprising is that U.S. businesses invested heavily in China, invested heavily in Japan, invested heavily in Europe, and reaped huge rewards from those investments over the last 30, 40 years. So the US is a financial colossus, right? Nobody comes close. And if you look at technology, the wave of the last 20 years, the Magnificent Seven, all US based.
Right.
Winner take all. They dominate the world. And then you hear the story about, we haven't done so well. We need to rectify things. We need to right the balance because we've been sort of put upon by the rest of the world. It's a hard narrative to understand if you're sitting here.
No, I understand that. And look, you're exactly correct, of course, that national wealth has never been greater, on so many metrics. But is it shared? Is it dispersed throughout society? It's not. It's incredibly concentrated. This is not a uniquely American problem, but I do think it's exacerbated in the United States, largely because of our success, quite frankly. You talk about winner take all. Yeah. A lot of these businesses, particularly in the AI and tech space, now it's fantastic that America's at the forefront of leading these innovations. But the problem within the United States is that it leads to an even greater concentration of success and wealth among a pretty small group of credentialed elites who, again, I believe exerted their will in very unjust ways upon the rest of society. They created an economic system, an economic order that worked very well for their benefit, but to the detriment of the working class masses. And you can only push them so long, and we see, for example, some of the really negative consequences, the pathologies, right? The substance abuse, the suicide rate, the despondency among regular people in the United States. And again, I know it's not uniquely American, but this is what I'm concerned about, as a citizen of the United States, and trying to solve this and trying to rectify it. I'll give you one just very practical ramification of this or example, really. It used to be, I'm 53 years old. When I was a boy, I grew up in a very middle-class suburb of Chicago. My family had 6 children. I was one of 6, and we survived very well on a single income for a middle-class family, and that was very typical. My entire neighborhood was generally people with a stay-at-home mom surviving on thriving on a middle-class income. That is simply not possible in the United States today. Only the wealthy have the luxury now of having a parent stay home, right? And I'm not saying that women have to stay home, by the way. That's not my point here. My point is that families should have the option. They should be able to thrive on a single income. That's not the case in the United States. And we know from polling, and I've polled this quite a bit. I do a lot of polling, Giles, and people overwhelmingly want it. Even if they're going to choose to be a 2-parent, 2 working family household, they want the option to be able to stay home. So we want policies that are going to accomplish that. And we believe, for example, that protectionism, which is no longer a dirty word in conservative circles in the United States, the American right is now pro-protectionist, and I believe we need to use that term. We don't think isolationism, by the way, is a dirty term anymore either. And I know that's kind of shocking, perhaps, in rooms like this, but that's the reality in the United States. And I think ultimately, by the way, it's going to make not just the U.S. stronger, but ultimately, I do believe it's going to make Canada, Latin America, and the world stronger, but particularly our allies. And I think we're showing, too, that we don't think America first means America alone. For example, example, I know there's a lot of Argentines here. We right now, Secretary Gherson, who I'm very close with, I think is very smartly creating a system to try to assist Argentina in a very significant way, right, in an illiquidity moment to try to help Argentina. I think that makes a lot of sense because this is our neighborhood. We care a lot about the Americas, and we should prioritize the Americas over any other region of the world. And I, for one, would argue we have no national interest in Ukraine. That is absolute nonsense for the United States to be spending our time and taking the kinds of risks in terms of antagonizing Russia that we're taking in Ukraine. But we have every interest in making sure that the Americas are prosperous and stable and safe.
Including us, then, presumably.
Yes, of course.
But then, you know, I think so getting change is always a tricky thing, because you want the change, but stability has often been a key component of economic growth. Right? And you get instability and you get turbulence, and often that has a significantly weakening effect on economic growth. You've got a White House now, with America First program that is, you know, quite, I would say, revolutionary almost. It's quite something to see. Yeah. Our Prime Minister was in Washington recently and called President Trump transformational, which is a good word. I think it's maybe more revolutionary. We're seeing a reordering of the economy. We're seeing a reordering of trade policy. We're seeing a reordering of government and government institutions. Right. We're seeing a reordering of international relations. All of this, we've seen it in 9 months. So it's a heck of a lot of change. Yeah. Can that much change be managed and get to the result that you've been talking about, which is a greater affluence across right. And prosperity across the U.S. Sort of social economic groups?
Right. So my quick answer is yes, yeah. It can be managed, but admittedly, it's a wild card, right? I mean, and you're right. We are vastly changing an economic system that dominated the world for 80 years, right? Essentially since World War II. We are upending that, and we're doing it in a very quick and sometimes slightly chaotic way. Now, I will say this, and I'm generally incredibly supportive of this administration and, of course, of President Trump. One mistake, I think, has been that there should be better predictability and visibility into what we're going to do with tariffs. For example, if it were up to me, I would say, okay, every country in the world must pay a toll to access the U.S. market. That just makes sense. We have the crown jewel consumer market in the world. We earned it, and we should charge for the premium seats effectively, right? If you want to get into the concert, you pay more for better seats. There should be roughly, I believe, a 10% tariff on every country in the world, whether you're a friend or foe. Then on top of that, I think there should be, what we should do is create essentially ladders where, depending on your policy towards us, how reciprocal you are to our trade in terms of national security, are you an ally? On top of that, there should be additional tariffs. In the case of China, I think they should be incredibly substantial and even punitive because of what we allowed China to get away with. And by the way, I think that it was a bipartisan failure in the United States to let China into the WTO on terms that were so beneficial to Beijing, where it used predatory trade practices to decimate American businesses, entire regions of the United States eviscerated by these trade policies. It did not make sense for the working class masses in the United States, and we're changing that, and we're changing it in a really significant way. I would also, though, point out to people, for whom this is a really troubling process, and people who are frustrated with President Trump, which I understand, and a lot of global businesses are, a lot of folks here probably very frustrated with President Trump. I think you need to realize that it was either this kind of change, and it is revolutionary, I agree with you, Giles, but it was either this, right, through the political process, or, believe me, there was going to be a populist uprising in the United States, okay? The American people are a volatile people. That's a good thing in many ways, right? It can really be an attribute, but it's also a risk. We are a very restless, volatile society. And in recent decades, we've been a very unhappy society, largely because, I believe, of terrible economic policies that have punished working class people. And that pressure valve, it's going to let out. Now, I think it's doing it in the right way. It's doing it through our Republican, small r, our Republican process. It's doing it through elections. This is what we want, right? This is how to peacefully revolutionize our country and our economy. But I'm also warning you that if we didn't go the peaceful route, we would have gotten there one way or the other, and let's not go the chaotic route.
I mean, that's an interesting point, and one that I think probably here in Canada and probably around the world is not as well recognized. Sure. as
we have a different character.
Yeah, and I think I think that's fair to say. And I think also when you talk about more of an isolationist, protectionist approach to trade, it's if you know your history, you know that probably through most of its history before the Second World War, the U.S. was fairly isolationist.
That's correct.
You got to remember, when you and stood apart from international relations in the way that, say, we didn't, or other, or Europeans, or even other Asian countries didn't. And you think about, for example, the U.S. was late, okay, from our point of view, late to join the First World War, late to join the Second World War. There was a view that this wasn't really our fight, right?
Right.
And eventually, very importantly, the U.S. did join, and we got victory. But it's also, we tend to forget that the U.S. has always, in most of its history, stood apart. And we had John Wilding here, a close associate of the president's over the last couple of days, and he made the point that the U.S., it was born separating from Europe.
Right.
That wasn't Canada's history. Very different. But let's take that and kind of think a bit about the Canadian context, because that's important for us, and maybe we need some advice from you. You talk about the trade imbalances that really, I think, have frustrated the U.S. for quite some time. Right. I used to live in the U.S. quite some time ago, even several decades ago, and you'd hear a lot about the trade deficit with Europe, trade deficits with Korea, with Japan and others, right. And a big frustration that their markets weren't as open to U.S. products as the U.S. market was to others. So the sense of taking unfair advantage that you alluded to. If you look at the Canadian context, though, somewhat different.
Sure.
We've had a free trade agreement in autos for 60 years. We've had free trade on everything else since '88, so a long time now. Very integrated economies. So when people talk about the 94 trade deals that you're negotiating, to get sort of better balance, I think we stand apart because we have an integrated economy, and at least for core sectors. And yet, we find ourselves being treated in exactly the same way. Line up with the 94, do your best. But the unraveling of what's been constructed between the two countries is much more intense.
Right.
And I guess there's a real sense of sort of disappointment here that the administration hasn't recognized the fundamental nature of the way our two economies have interacted and the significant economic cost of unraveling that or unscrambling the omelet.
Yeah. No, I understand that, and I understand the frustration for Canada, because I agree, you are different from every other country in the world, right, regarding your relationship economically and otherwise with the United States, and so I understand that you want to be treated differently, and you probably should be, quite frankly. But I will also say this, please understand from the American point of view that we willingly gave up our advantages in trade, right, and we did so because of the Cold War. We did so for geostrategic reasons. We wanted to build Western Europe and Japan specifically post-World War II, and so we effectively surrendered our trade advantages, and we even agreed to trade terms that were really disadvantageous to the United States. We did it purposefully, though, right? We did it for a bigger goal. But the Cold War has been over for quite a long time, and we're still getting abused in trade globally. So I think, unfortunately, Canada is going to suffer some of the consequences that admittedly are not its fault, because it has mostly been a very fair, not entirely, but mostly been a pretty fair trading partner with the United States, who probably deserves to be treated differently. But my honest answer is it's not going to happen. And my advice for Canadians then would be, well, what do you do? Well, focus more on Canada, okay? You have a big market here, right? You can and should trade with the United States. Of course, we're always going to continue to trade with each other, but make Canada great again. And by the way, I would argue, from my point of view, I'm not Canadian, so I'm not telling you what to do, would be start restricting immigration, start being protectionist in Canada in every way. But you have a big developed market. You can be really successful without the United States if you need to be. Now, again, I think we're going to help each other in many ways. Security, trade, otherwise. You are, in many ways, our closest ally in the world. And thankfully, a peaceful border forever, and we hope, forevermore. But that is my honest advice, and I know that might sound a little bit harsh, but focus on your country. And I would tell this to any country in the world, right? Particularly if you're big enough that you have scale, that you don't need to trade with the United States, right? There are some countries that just simply have to trade because they're so small.
But trade has two sides to it, right? Trade has, other countries, including Canada, exporting to the U.S. to that big, rich market, which you've described. But it also has, exports to other countries. And we happen to be the largest buyer of U.S. products and services. We have a huge trade imbalance on services. Yeah. And in fact, on manufactured items, we have a big trade imbalance with the U.S. You have a surplus with us. So So who's taking unfair advantage of whose market? So the irony for us is we're being sort of accused of taking unfair advantage, like everybody else, of the US market, when we find ourselves actually not in the same position as Mexico, Europe. We do have a surplus, but only because we sell so much oil and gas to the US, at a discount, I should say, which the US needs to run its economy. So if you put that aside, and there's huge interest in growing our oil and gas exports to the US on the part of Americans, but then you take the rest of our economy, we have a deficit.
Yeah.
Right? And yet we're hit with tariffs at the same time on autos, on steel, and on critical parts of our economy, which is very hard to justify, in my view.
Yeah. No, again, I understand that. And I agree, by the way, that, for example, Western Europe has been way more abusive of the United States than Canada has been in terms of trade terms,
they have different standards, they have non-tariff barriers.
Yeah, correct.
Which we don't have.
Just the implicit VAT subsidy, right? By removing the VAT, that subsidy, they effectively subsidize 20% all of their exports, right? So no, I'm agreeing with you, but I'm also cautioning you that I don't think there's going to be a carve out in Washington, D.C. There's just not an appetite for it right now in the Trump administration. I don't think there is in the American public to say, we're going to carve out Canada, put them aside, and treat them completely differently, even if it's deserved. I just don't think that's going to happen.
Is there some wisdom in waiting then on our side? You're doing 94 deals, you're trying to shift the balance with all these different countries, and you might be successful. Right, you may start to see signs of success. You've already struck deals with the European Union, with the UK, with Japan, with South Korea. So as the fruits of those deals, a better balance, you start getting better exports to those countries. Imports perhaps become a little less, better balance. Should we be waiting in the wings? Because at that point, does the things calm down and it's a better context for us? I think the concern that Canadians have is getting into this maelstrom where we're kind of treated the same and yet the conditions are different.
Right.
And maybe this is not a propitious moment to be thinking about trying to cut a deal.
Yeah, no, Giles, I think that would be smart to wait. And I'll tell you the main reason why is thankfully real wages are rising in the United States and rising pretty significantly. Now, the American people don't feel it yet, right? They're not confident. So we haven't seen it in the polling, and they still have, frankly, kind of PTSD from the inflation of Bidenomics. So it's going to we need real wages to continue to grow for some time. But if that continues to happen, I think you're going to find much more willingness to compromise on trade terms if regular Americans believe that they're finally getting ahead, that they're getting wealthier, that they're being rewarded for their work. So I think there is some wisdom in that regard in trying to wait. I would also, caution this for people who are frustrated by President Trump and frustrated by our new trade tactics that. Look, the critics, I think, have to admit, if they're being honest, that most of their predictions of doom just have not happened, right? I mean, the world didn't fall apart, right? Markets are at all-time highs. Trade is continuing at a very rigorous pace.
You have huge deficit, though.
Of course.
Debt.
Yeah, massive problem.
And that worries people.
Right? It should. Worries the heck out of me, believe me, every single day. And there seems to be no real constituency in Washington, D.C. now to even do anything about it. I mean, we're really, I think whistling past the graveyard to some degree with $37 trillion in debt. Yeah, absolutely, massive problem.
So last question, really, we only have a few seconds left, but I think there's a lot around the world and in Canada, sometimes I think people are thinking, if we can only get through the next 3.5 years, we'll be fine. And that's a natural tendency. But is this a moment or an era?
Oh, no, it's an era. And if I have anything to say about it, it's not going to be 3.5 years, because after that, we're going to have 8 years of J.D. Vance, who, if anything, is a little bit more insistent on these issues than President Trump. And I know that from my private conversations with J.D. Vance, as well as what he states out there publicly. So, no, this is a new era. Populism is here to stay in the United States, and I think in many countries. To me, the only real question is it going to be the populism of the left in the United States? Is it going to be that Bernie Sanders, AOC, Ilhan Omar variety? Or is it going to be the MAGA populism on the right? And what I would tell you is, if you're somebody who can't stand MAGA, you believe me, you like us better than the alternative, okay? Because the alternative is truly radical and extremist, and the populist moment, in my view, is not going anywhere in the United States.
Thank you. We've run out of time, but what a great conversation. I really appreciate it, Steve.
Appreciate it, Giles. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.